Hello and welcome to this webinar for all those who are joining us from different parts of the world. A very warm welcome. I'm Rohini Kohli, your moderator for today. I'm a senior technical advisor for adaptation planning and policy at UNDP. The objective of today's webinar, it's a part of a knowledge exchange that aims to share tools and resources that are available or could be adopted to help develop financing strategies for adaptation and to facilitate sharing of emerging experiences among country representatives. We'll be focusing on financing strategies for national adaptation plans, for adaptation, for advancing adaptation through the nationally determined contribution investment plans, and also through the integrated national financing frameworks. I think as many of you might be aware, there is a big global discussion going on around adaptation finance and identifying solutions and instruments that can work. So this webinar and also the series is very much geared towards identifying those practical strategies and solutions that countries are employing. We all know about the challenges for adaptation finance, and there are also a lot of figures and data available about the gaps that are there as well as the barriers. But we are certainly in these webinars trying to really look towards some of the available experiences and solutions that can be employed, and not solely focusing on the challenges. This webinar is actually part of an initiative called the Adaptation Pipeline Accelerator, which has been launched by the UN Secretary General, the Climate Action Team, and has UNDP, the GCF, and the NDC partnership as its core partners. This is a series of knowledge exchanges, along with partners and countries to facilitate this knowledge exchange with emerging experiences in developing countries, including tools and methods, best practices, and lessons learned. And to be also very clear that it's very much to do with the national adaptation plans, advancing them, the financing of these, as well as the nationally determined contributions, because both are the vehicles for crowding and investment. This initiative, we're sort of working across our climate change portfolio at UNDP and our Climate Promise, which is the world's largest offer on support to the nationally determined contributions enhancement and implementation. The webinar today is being recorded and interpretation is available in French and Spanish. For those of you that would like to hear it in those languages, there is a little icon at the lower part of your screen. And if you click on it, you will find interpretation is available in French and Spanish. And actually, before I introduce the agenda for today, and also for all those of you who are joining, we want to do a short poll just to understand, who's coming in from where. And I'm going to just request my colleague Melanie to just run us through the poll. Over to you, Melanie.
Yes, so you can go to menti.com and enter the code you see on the screen, or from your cell phone, you can scan the QR card.
So we're going to give you all at least a couple of minutes so that we can sort of get a sense of, where we have people joining from. I can see that there are some people that have already logged on, and we're finding the dots already in parts of North America, also Africa, and also parts of Europe, and around Central America and the Caribbean region. Great. We also have people probably joining in from Asia, and I have to really thank them because it's very late in Asia at the moment. But that's, I think, so we weren't sure how many people would be able to join. but I can see that we have some people there. Let's give it another 30 seconds or so before we close the poll. All right, wonderful. I think we have about 1/3 of the people joining are almost through the poll. So this is actually quite a good spread. There's a lot of participants from Africa and a few from Asia, from East Asia and South Asia, and a few from North America. So I think that shows us a very good spread of who's joining us. I think maybe, Melanie, we could go to, yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So colleagues, I'm just going to come back to the agenda now. So we basically have a very impressive lineup of speakers because we really do want to have those country experiences and tools presentations. And you can see our speakers on the screen, and I will be introducing each of them when we go through their presentations. Please be aware that because we have a really impressive lineup, we will be taking Q&A throughout the session because we do not have a Q&A at the end, due to the number of speakers that we have. So please use your Q&A function, which is again at the bottom of the screen. It's a live function. It can be used in English or in other languages, and we'll try to direct the Q&A, to different, speakers as we go along, so that we don't leave this till the end. And please be aware also that the webinar is being recorded. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to hear experiences, from the agenda will share a subnational experience from Bosnia and Herzegovina. We will then hear a national experience from Niger. We will also hear about a tool from our colleague from the NDC partnership and the application of that in a couple of countries. We will have a government representative from Ghana who will be giving the experience of Ghana. And then finally, we will be looking at also an experience from a financing adaptation from the INFF. So that's the agenda for today. And without further ado, I'm actually going to maybe move to the first speaker. I just want to remind all the speakers they have 7 to 8 minutes each. And that they should, after their presentations, be aware of the Q&A. Let me introduce with great pleasure Ms. Natasha Tucik, who is the head of Department for Local Economic Development, Investment and Energy Efficiency for the city of Trebinje in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She's involved in the development, monitoring and implementation of development projects funded by multi-donor different sources of finance. And without further ado, she's going to really speak on municipal level adaptation finance strategies in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Mr. Trebinje, Tucik, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Hello to everybody. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Hello to everyone. City of Trebinje is located, next slide please, is located to the banks of Trebišnjica River in the southern part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I will run through first few slides, so next please. Climate change is already causing increasing air temperature and is expected to provoke flooding, extended winds, prolonged drought periods, shift in precipitation patterns, and extreme heat or cold conditions. Next please. Bosnia and Herzegovina recognize the importance of the threat posed to the development of country by climate change and the end of adapting to it in order to avoid or minimize negative consequences. In order to achieve required results, engagement of local governments is crucial, in our opinion. Next, please. The most vulnerable sectors in Bosnia and Herzegovina are agriculture, water resources, biodiversity, tourism, forestry, human health. Next, please. In the next few slides, you can see key climate pressure, storm winds, next urban flooding, next long dry summers, okay? CCI work preparation of the financing strategy in municipality. As a part of the work of the preparation, the following activities were carrying out. Analysis of the municipality's current budgetary and extra budgetary expenses, sources of funding and other financing mechanisms, Review of the current development strategy in terms of taking into account issues related to climate change, review and summary of current mid-term investment plans, preparation procedures in relating to climate change adaptation, preparation of recommendations for the municipality. Next, please. Definitely, municipality needs financial projections in a multi-year horizon in order to estimate municipal capacity to implement capital investment projects. Next. To analyze the consequences of adapted policy, local taxes and fees. Next, please. To estimate future burden of debt service. On next slide, you can see analysis of municipalities' current budgetary and extra budgetary expenses, sources of funding, and other financing mechanisms. On this table, you can find our results of our analysis, and our conclusion is that financial situation of Trebinje municipality can be described as stable. In predicted period, funds available after debt service are on a high level. Next slide, please. Trebinje city has development strategy for a period 2018 up to 2027, and one of the strategic goals set in the strategy is a more energy efficient, clearer and better protected environment. Strategy also mentions climate change as a challenge in some areas. Nevertheless, it focused rather on improving the current conditions than implementing measures minimizing future negative impact of climate change. An environmental and protection plan prepared as a part of the strategy explicitly states the goal of a reduction of CO2 emission. Projects including in the environmental protection plans account for only 22% of the total value of investment foreseen in the strategy. Next. City of Trebinje climate change adaptation financing strategy is fully compliant with SDG 11, SDG 13, climate change adaptation and low emission development strategy, Bosnia and Herzegovina's National Plan adaptation, City of Trebinje development strategy, environmental protection plan. In order to prepare the CCA financing strategy, the following had to be done. Prepare financial capacity of the City of Trebinje and current capital investment plans and procedures in the City of Trebinje. Please, next. Objectives of the strategy. We found 8 objectives, and you can see it on this slide. It is integration of climate change, consideration in the strategic and planning documentation, establishing a data collection systems, building public awareness, building capacity of the public administration to provide advice on climate-informed investment decisions to local politicians, enhancing the capital investment plans. Objective 6, establishing a department if possible for obtaining external funds. Objective 7, strengthening financial independence by increasing their own and stable sources of income. And Objective 8, making greater use of alternative investment. Next, please. Trebinje, based on the presented CCA financing strategy, I'm sorry, we have a storm outside, so can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. And Ms. Tuchik, if you could, maybe you'll have to slow down a little bit for the interpreters,
Okay.
but we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I will.
Yeah.
So, as I said on this slide, you can see that we prepared revised project proposals that include aspects related to the project's climate change impact and resilience. Given a higher priority to environmental aspects in the evaluation criteria, including those related to climate change adaptation and resilience, prepared more detailed project financing plans with a precise indication of the source of funds, clearly linked projects from the medium-term plan with capital investment plan with the plans included in the strategy in such a way that they're coupled with the strategic goals of the municipality, included aspects related to climate change at every stage of investment planning and implementation process, extending the planning budget perspective to a time horizon of not less than 5 years. It is best to adjust the projection horizon to the time of servicing loans and other financial instruments in order to properly assess their impact on the future budget of the municipality. Next, please. On this slide, you can see some of the projects we plan to do in the period from 2020. And as you can see, we implemented some old projects and some of them are in the process. But definitely we cannot, as you can see, we cannot do it alone. We need funds, we need loans, we need help from government power. Next slide, please. And conclusion, the local community recognizes the problems caused by climate change, but cannot handle them on its own. In order to adapt and mitigate the consequences of climate change and improve comprehensive protection against natural disasters, the best solution is to unlock climate finance funds for local community projects. Also, I can say that we have capacity for implementation and managing different kinds of projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tucek, and we understand there's a storm going on outside, so
Yes.
really appreciate your presentation. I want to assure all the participants that we will be, at the end of the sessions, we will be PDFing all the presentations and sharing them. But your presentation showed very clearly the degree of detailed planning that has been done at the city level, including the investments that are required, but also the balance sheet of the municipality, including the sources of finance that are available and where there are gaps. So I think this is a very interesting example of subnational adaptation planning, which is actually looking at the current resources available and also the priorities and how to balance them. So thank you so much, Ms. Tucek. And at the moment, I don't see any questions in the chat, but we'll direct them to you perhaps when they come. Please keep an eye on the chat. So with that, I'm going to, in the interest of time, move to our next presenter. That's Mr. Musa Gusmane, who is a NAP project coordinator, the National Adaptation Plan coordinator at UNDP Niger, and he's been supporting the management of UNDP's climate change portfolio and providing technical support to the executive secretariat of the CNEDD for the implementation of the NAP. He's going to speak in French. And I think for colleagues that don't understand French, please use the interpretation. And over to you, Mr. Gusmane, and very request you to keep the presentation to 8 minutes. Over to you. Yeah, and we can't hear you yet, Mr. Gusmane. Over to you. Mr. Gusmane, I think your audio is not working. We can't hear you clearly.
Bonsoir.
Yes, now we can hear you. Yes. Okay, good. Okay. Please go ahead. Yes.
Bonsoir, comme je le disais, bonjour. Comme je le disais, je suis monsieur, j'ai coordonné le processus du plan national d'adaptation au Niger. Alors, à introduction, disons que les changements climatiques constituent au Niger un risque majeur pour l'atteinte des objectifs du développement durable. Et c'est une des raisons pour le Niger a demandé l'appui des partenaires, notamment le programme des Nations Unies, PNUD, pour mobiliser des financements très élaborés son plan national d'adaptation climatique. Alors, plus d'élaboration du plan national d'adaptation climatique, nous nous sommes rendus compte d'obstacles majeurs. Le faible accès au financement, le paysage même de la finance climatique qui évolue, qui est dynamique et complexe. Et pour y faire face, on a donc décidé, dans le cadre de ce processus d'élaboration, d'élaborer une stratégie nationale de mobilisation des options d'adaptation qui en seront issues. Alors, quel est l'objectif visé? C'est le développement durable du pays par la réduction des impacts négatifs des changements. Il a deux objectifs spécifiques, si on peut le dire. Réduire l'impact des changements climatiques, mais aussi faciliter l'intégration de l'adaptation climatique dans les politiques, stratégies, programmes et autres. Suite à cet exercice, nous avons 25 options prioritaires. Et ces options sont composées de 90 projets, dont 30 et 56 à recherche. Dans le cadre de ce PNA-là, 3 axes avec des priorités stratégiques. Nous avons le premier axe qui au renforcement de la coordination entre les institutions et priorité et renforcer le rôle des mécanismes de coordination. Deuxième priorité, c'est d'intégrer l'adaptation au changement climatique nationale à travers une approche programmatique. C'est de voir comment est-ce qu'au niveau du ministère du Plan ou des Finances, comment est-ce qu'on peut les accompagner à intégrer la question surtout de l'adaptation. La troisième, c'est le renforcement des capacités pour soutenir la mise en œuvre du PN. Ce qui a fait que dès le départ du processus, on a et tous les acteurs pour qu'au finish, non seulement informer de la question climatique, mais aussi qu'ils comprennent où est-ce que nous voulons aller à ce PNA. Et la priorité de ce premier axe-là, c'est la coopération et la sensibilisation qui sont des éléments très importants. Le deuxième axe, c'est la mise en œuvre d'actions sectorielles. Il faut rappeler que dans le Niger, nous avons retenu 5 secteurs prioritaires. L'élevage, nous avons les transports, la foresterie, la santé publique, humide. Je dois souligner qu'il y a 2 secteurs prioritaires, dont un a fait d'un PNA sectoriel, c'est le secteur de l'agriculture, et le secteur de ressources en eau, dont le PNA est actuellement en cours d'élaboration. Et nous avons le troisième axe, qui est la mobilisation pour la mise en œuvre du PNA. Des axes les plus importants, parce qu'il s'agit de la mobilisation des ressources. C'est la mobilisation des ressources d'abord techniques, ou avoir les capacités d'élaborer d'abord le programme, mais aussi la mobilisation des ressources. Une fois les projets et programmes élaborés, il faut bien qu'on mobilise les ressources pour la de ces programmes. Alors, toute stratégie en elle-même, elle a 3 objectifs. Renforcer la gouvernance et la capacité pour la mobilisation du financement climatique. Renforcer la coopération avec les institutions dans le financement climatique et climatique dans la budgétisation, mise en œuvre efficace et efficiente de l'adaptation. Ça, c'est les qui sont visés par la stratégie. Ici, comme je l'ai déjà avant, les secteurs qui sont, je les ai cités, c'est l'élevage, les ressources, santé publique, transport et zones humides. Maintenant, pour la mise en œuvre, un des 3 objectifs, puisqu'au niveau de la stratégie de finance, nous avons identifié 3 objectifs qui, pour nous, en tout cas, s'ils sont mesurés, nous permettront en tout cas d'atteindre le plan visé celui de la mise en œuvre du PNA. Le premier, c'est d'abord renforcer la gouvernance et la capacité pour la mobilisation du financement. Donc, il y a un certain nombre de mesures, notamment la création d'un fonds climat pour soutenir la collecte, la coordination et la comptabilité. Mais aussi, il faut améliorer le cadre et de mise en œuvre des interventions d'adaptation. C'est-à-dire que tout ce qui est en train de se passer pour le moment au niveau national, il faut de concertation où tous les acteurs doivent se retrouver en commun les interventions afin qu'on ait des significatifs. C'est renforcer la coopération entre les institutions spécialisées. Donc ça, c'est le renforcement des capacités des institutions nationales et régionales impliquées en climatique dans la mise en œuvre d'un. Nous avons des institutions qui sont installées au Niger, le centre Agrimet qui concerne, nous avons par exemple les BAD, nous avons l'UEMOA, tous doivent en tout cas être associés à la mobilisation des ressources. Et les risques climatiques dans la budgétisation, en connaissance et la préparation des ressources humaines, de la finance climatique pour favoriser l'effet de levier. Comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, sa technique doit être développée pour être, en tout cas, de préparer des ressources. quelques informations à contenir la stratégie de financement. La structure qui est la tutelle du NA, qui est le Conseil national de l'environnement préférable, qui est rattaché au cabinet du ministre, doit donc toutes les informations, les mandats des donateurs, leur politique, les différents critères d'admissibilité et de présentation des demandes de financement. C'est aujourd'hui le Niger vers où le fonds d'adaptation, c'est ce qui doit guider en tout cas les promoteurs de projets en termes de, en termes de procédure, en termes de domaine. Les ministères sectoriels à cette communication des informations pour une meilleure prise en compte de leur programme d'action. Parce que la plupart des ministères sectoriels là, qui sont les promoteurs, parce que les politiques, c'est eux qui ont les stratégies, c'est eux qui doivent concevoir les projets et les programmes et les mettre en qui doivent être associés.
Mr. Guzman, we cannot hear you. Could you? Yeah, I think maybe we've lost him. Just please, let's give him another 5 seconds. Mr. Guzman, we cannot hear you. Could you speak louder, please?
Ok. Je suis d'ailleurs à la dernière slide qui est relative aux recommandations. Par rapport donc à la mise de la stratégie de mobilisation, dans le court terme, nous aurons à faire l'identification en œuvre d'un certain nombre d'actions. Donc, dans l'immédiat, ce qu'il fallait faire, c'est la gestion dans les meilleurs délais du processus du cadre législatif et institutionnel à l'adaptation. Nous avons un certain nombre de structures qui gèrent la question des changements et de façon l'adaptation. Il va falloir un cadre législatif et notamment, par exemple, les aspects de relation à l'identification des indicateurs et autres. Nous avons à organiser tous les dialogues avec les bailleurs de fonds pour la présentation et la diffusion à l'échelle des priorités d'adaptation. À l'élaboration du document PNA, nous avons déjà, dans le cadre de la œuvre, élaboré à 3 notes conceptuelles. Donc, présenter et les 25 actions dont j'avais parlé tout à l'heure, mais aussi les 2 à 3 notes conceptuelles partenaires pour voir dans quelle mesure ils pourront à mobiliser les financements qui leur permettent en œuvre les options. Les 3 notes conceptuelles que nous avons déjà au secteur de l'agriculture et de l'élevage, des ressources en eau. Nous avons le renforcement de l'approche stratégique à travers un dialogue constant avec les financeurs internationaux et les parties prenantes, en particulier le secteur privé. L'une des innovations dans le processus d'élaboration du PNA Niger, c'est comment amener le secteur à mobiliser ou à s'intéresser à la question des changements, notamment l'adaptation. Pour ce faire, vont élaborer une mobilisation du secteur privé, une stratégie déjà commencé à partager avec ceux parce que nous avons déjà organisé 3 ateliers régionaux et de regrouper en tout cas tous les acteurs par la question pour partager le contenu de cette stratégie, mais aussi leur faire comprendre que eux-mêmes ils disposent d'un comme secteur privé pour s'intégrer ou s'intéresser au changement climatique et de façon particulière de l'adaptation. Et de mettre en place un plan de mise à jour de la stratégie. Lui-même, nous l'avons calé sur une période de 5 ans. Et à l'issue de 5 ans-là, nous allons à une revue, voir qu'est-ce qui a marché dans la mise en œuvre, qu'est-ce qui a marché, qu'est-ce qui est venu comme et qu'est-ce qui a à réorienter. Et c'est de la même manière de faire le point de ce qui a été mobilisé comme résultat, ce qui a été levé comme et qu'est-ce que ça a donné comme impact en termes de mise en œuvre. En conclusion, je dirais que en tout cas a fait son exercice d'élaboration du PNA. Il a des options d'adaptation dans un secteur, dans des secteurs qui sont vulnérables, mais qui constituent le poumon de l'économie nationale, qui sont en plan de développement économique et social. Et nous pensons que le Niger, en tout cas, doit être accompagné dans la mise en œuvre de ce PNA, en tout cas de faire face aux effets néfastes de changement, surtout de répondre, en tout cas, aux besoins moyens à long terme des populations et du Niger. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Mr. Guzman, for that presentation. I also understand sometimes the sound was interrupted during the interpretation, but I hope everyone was able to also hear the slides. This was thank you, Mr. Guzman, because you're actually showing a very different example of how there's a specific financing strategy at the national level. And it's kind of a sort of a another step in the National Adaptation Plan process. So Niger has defined its priorities, but it has not stopped there. It is engaging with the Ministry of Finance on this financing strategy, and also engaging with quite a lot of financial sector actors. So I think that shows that it's not enough to define those priorities in terms of the pipelines and the 36 priority interventions, but also to engage in an exercise which relates to sort of like the discussion with all the financial actors. So thank you very much for that. There are some questions in the chat for you, Mr. Guzman. If you could answer them, maybe you could answer them on the text. If you can open the chat box, I think they are referring to some specific questions about your presentation. But thank you so much for that presentation. I think at this stage, I actually want to move toward.
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Guzman, would you like to answer them live? Can you see the questions?
Hello? Oui?
Yeah. Mr. Guzman, can you see the questions on the chat? Okay, maybe I could I ask one of the interpreters maybe to read out the questions to Mr. Guzman?
Oui, j'ai consulté les, j'ai vu une relative au financement des sources de financement. Et le Niger déjà travaille avec un nombre de partenaires, et, en tout cas les changements climatiques. Alors parmi ces, nous avons déjà l'un des principaux partenaires, c'est le PNUD, Nations Unies pour le développement, mais aussi d'autres partenaires qui interviennent dans le domaine des changements climatiques. Nous avons la Banque mondiale à travers un certain nombre de projets. Nous avons aussi l'Union européenne qui intervient à travers un certain nombre de projets. Si la Banque française, parce qu'en fait l'exercice, nous l'avons les sectoriels concernés, et chacun de ces secteurs-là est sur la base de sa programmation. Il y a des stratégies qui existent avec des plans d'action. Ces plans d'action-là, il y a des options qui sont financées, qui ne sont pas financées. Et donc, nous avons des options qui sont financées par les partenaires, d'une part, ne sont pas financées par les acteurs. Donc, celles-là, elles sont financées par ces différents acteurs. Mais n'oubliez pas que le Niger à lui-même, il est en train de faire des efforts dans le financement de l'adaptation, parce que dans le cadre de ce processus, nous avons une autre initiative qu'on a appelée CPR. Donc, ce CPR-là nous a comprendre pendant la 2020 qu'est-ce qui est dans le secteur dans le domaine des changements climatiques, ce sont les secteurs qui sont concernés. Donc, on compte que, en tout cas, le avec ses partenaires, font beaucoup d'efforts. Et pour que l'État mette la main lui-même, nous avons déjà organisé avec les députés. J'ai le PNA avec eux, puisque dans toute la loi, pour qu'ils comprennent et d'amener, en tout cas d'engager aussi dans la lutte contre les changements climatiques. Parce qu'il faut comprendre ce que le Niger aujourd'hui ne peut pas sans prendre en compte la question des changements climatiques. Et je crois que là, les députés l'ont compris, que lui-même l'a compris à travers la note qu'on a écrite. Nous sommes dans la dynamique de mobiliser des ressources. Je ne sais pas si j'ai répondu à la...
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Guzman. I think also I understand that some of the sound was interrupted. I hope the colleagues on the call could listen, but maybe we would also request Mr. Guzman to maybe type out a few of the answers in the chat. But let's move on to the poll now. Friends and colleagues, we are now on the second poll before we go to the next segment. So we're going to ask you all to go to Menti, and you can see the code. I think that there's also a link on perhaps being shared on the chat, but otherwise you can go to menti.com, and you would need to basically, answer just one question. And the question is that, in the country, your country, the one you're based in, or the city you're based in, what is the current status of your country's adaptation finance strategy? It could be a NAP strategy, like we saw for Niger. It could be an NDC investment plan. It could be, one of those INFF, the SDG financing strategies. It could be a different type of adaptation finance strategy. It could just be a city level adaptation strategy. So please let us know if it started or if it's, quite advanced or under implementation. It would be very, very useful for us to know, just as a kind of a spot information, how the adaptation finance strategies in your locations are advancing. We'll give it another few minutes because we have quite a lot of people on the call now. So let me just give you another minute or so that you can answer. I would encourage all of you who have not been able to yet sign on to Menti to sort of do so and see if we can get a sense of how many countries have advanced. You may have more than one of these in your country. It's not necessary that it's just one. Yeah, I'm just still waiting for about 1/3 of people to fill our survey. I can see that the number is climbing now.
Laquelle des questions? Quelle des questions? Parce que moi, j'ai perdu l'interprétation.
Okay.
Alors, où est-ce qu'on peut avoir l'interprétation de la...
Yeah, Mr. Guzman, the question is, it's a survey question on how, what is the status of the adaptation financing strategy in your country? Has it started? Has it not started? Or is it under implementation? And it can be any of these strategies that include adaptation that is on the screen. And I would ask maybe one of our colleagues in the team that speaks French to also type this out in the chat so that it's clear. Okay, so I think maybe we are now close to, we've got, I think, significant number of responses. I think around 40 people have answered. So I think what we can see here is that there are some countries that have advanced to some extent on the National Adaptation Plan financing strategies. There are maybe just a few more that and please, this is not to really do the counting. This is more, I think, for us to just have an idea of how, if adaptation is advancing through these strategies. So we can see that in some cases the NDC investment plan is advancing more, you know, sort of also further. And in some other cases, there is another type of adaptation financing strategy which has started. We don't know what that is, but certainly there are others. And then there is the INFF, which is the Integrated National Financing Framework. That is for many development, it's for all the development goals of the country. So it's not purely adaptation, but adaptation is part of quite a lot of, you know, sort of the sectoral goals of the national development goals. It could be SDGs, etc. So it does look like there is been you know, significant progress, at least amongst some of the people that have answered the survey. So I think with that, maybe we are going to close the poll, and maybe we will now move on to our actually next presenter, because we have now moved from the specific adaptation planning strategy to the NDC investment guidance and the way that this is being applied in the case of adaptation. And I'd like to introduce with great pleasure Adrian Flores Aguilar. He is a climate finance associate from the NDC partnership, and he supports knowledge and learning activities within the partnership finance strategy. And I think it's important we listen to him because as of April 2023, more than 173 countries have submitted NDCs, which are updated, and out of which 145 are adaptation components. So the NDC investment planning is an extremely important exercise for adaptation. And with that, I would hand over to you, Adrian, for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rohini. Can you hear me well?
Yes,
very
well.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having the NDC partnership in this interesting webinar. Today, I'm going to share a quick presentation on the work that the NDC partnership is doing around investment planning. In particular, I'm going to make a presentation on our recently launched NDC investment planning guide. My short presentation is going to be divided into sections. First, I'm going to talk about the rationale and overall features of the guide. And later, I'm going to make a quick tour over the stages of the guide, providing some examples so you get a better sense of what it is that we're trying to achieve with the guide. Next slide, please. To kickstart my presentation, I would like to address this question: why did we develop a guide, or why do we think an investment planning guide is relevant? So significant challenges still exist in matching climate finance with impactful projects. This is particularly the case of adaptation projects, like it's clear in this UNEP adaptation report from last year. Whether enable environments are not developed enough, or there's a need to further engage and coordinate stakeholders, or whether adaptation projects are not investment ready. The fact is that investments are not flowing where they are needed, and they are not flowing at the speed and scale that countries need. So to address this gap, the NDC partnership developed this guide to provide stakeholders, decision makers, countries in general, with a resource to structure their investments around climate commitments, NDCs, NAPs, etc., to make sure that finance is flowing where it's needed and at the speed and scale that is needed. Next slide, please. That's how in February of this year, we launched our NDC investment planning guide, which incorporates experiences and best practices from our countries and members. It also incorporates input from international literature and from expert and partner input as well. It's important to mention that the guide was developed in close consultation with our partners, but also in close consultation with other relevant stakeholders, such as the private sector. One of the most relevant features of the guide is that it combines a traditional project-based approach to investment planning with a programmatic approach to investment planning. And by combining these two approaches, we think that the guide is a useful resource for countries and stakeholders in general to not only leverage the resources that are available externally from climate funds, developing partners, MDBs, or even private sector, but to catalyze or trigger the economy programmatic transformation, economy-wide transformation, or systemic transformation within an economy to redirect internal finance flows, for example, from national budgets. Next slide, please. Another important feature of the guide is that the guide is unique in the investment planning, proposes an investment planning approach that is unique to each country. In that sense, the investment planning builds from the climate commitments of each country, whether it's NDCs or National Adaptation Plans. These climate commitments outline the scope, the scale, and the ambition of the required investments. Ultimately, NDC investment planning is the process of identifying investments and mobilizing investments to support countries in achieving the objectives that the climate objectives or targets that the country has defined in several instruments, NDCs, NAPs, and other instruments. Next slide, please. So in terms of the structure of the guide is has a really straightforward structure with 3 stages and 11 components. It also includes a series of steps in developing an investment plan. The guide highlights the different tasks that country can implement in terms of capacity building, monitoring and reporting, investment identification, prioritization, mobilization. Even though the guide provides a series of steps in a logical sequence, we like to highlight that the guide is not a manual and it's not a checklist. Even though we share a checklist at the end of the guide should be seen as a flexible instrument for countries to use depending on their capacities and progress in the investment planning process. So for example, if a country has a strong institutional arrangements and has already identified and prioritized investments, perhaps they just need to focus on the investment mobilization stage, so they can go to that section and look for the resources available there, and so on. Next stage, please. Next slide, please. So in terms of the stages, the first stage is the investment planning capacity. This stage is cross-cutting. And in this stage, all the institutional arrangements that facilitate that identification and prioritization and mobilization of investments are set. Also, roles and responsibilities are defined, and stakeholders are engaged. In addition, the foundations for the monitoring and reporting of the investment planning guide are set. One example from the partnership comes from Sao Tome and Principe, where the country mapped the government institutions linked to climate action. They mapped their their legal mandate and their capacity, so they can provide recommendations, and they provide the recommendations to strengthen and creating an institutional enabling environment. Next slide, please. The next stage is the investment needs identification and prioritization. During this stage, investments are identified based on climate commitments, National Adaptation Plans, NDCs especially. Also, they are costed, and if there's any funding gap, it is assessed during this stage. And based on this gap analysis, investments are prioritized. And one example from the partnership comes from Jordan, where the country conducted a cost-benefit analysis of 35 prioritized projects. They assessed the adaptation potential, but also the mitigation potential of these actions or projects, and also assess potential co-benefits. Next slide, please. And finally, the investment mobilization stage. During this stage, barriers to investments, to the identified investments or prioritized investments, are identified and addressed through tools, strategies, policies, regulation, or financial instruments. And also the prioritized investments are matched with available sources of finance, whether it's through project preparation or any other programmatic means that the government identifies. And one example comes from St. Kitts and Nevis, where the country identified the barriers to investments, to the implementation and the financing of their investment plan, but also they assess the potential technical assistance and financial instruments required to address or to target those barriers. Next slide, please. So this is the full picture of the NDC investment planning guide. I know that I provided a very quick tour through the stages. But if you want to learn more about the work that we are doing on NDC investment planning, or learn about examples from the partnership, feel free to reach out to our website. We have resources, we have summaries in several languages, and we are producing more materials for our partners to learn about NDC investment planning. Also, feel free to reach out to the support unit. We will be happy to discuss how your country or organization can make good use of the guide. I will leave it there. Rahini, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I think that's a very useful tool that you have presented, which is really looking at how the adaptation component of the NDCs, how, as you said, it's not prescriptive, but does have, it sort of breaks down into more manageable steps. How adaptation finance can be linked to this investments that are identified in this in the NDC. I think I just want to remind everybody on the call that we would welcome your live questions and answers. There's a text chat, so please do share if there are questions, because we will not be able to. We don't have a time separately at the end of the session. So please do share them there. We are running a little bit behind time. So actually, we've sequenced the presentation in such a way that we are very happy to actually get now our Miss Juliana Bempa, who is a Principal Program Officer at the Climate Change Unit of Ghana's Environmental Protection Agency, who's responsible for transparency issues and carbon markets. She's also a member of the Project Management Unit for Ghana's Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency. And she's going to present on Ghana's NDC financing strategy. Ms. Bempa, the floor is yours. And if I could remind you to maybe keep your presentation to 7 to 8 minutes. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay,
thank you.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So I'm going to present to you on Ghana's NDC financing strategy. By way of background and objective, next slide, please. Ghana was actually among one of the 196 countries that adopted the Paris Agreement. And so we submitted our initial NDCs to the UNFCCC in 2016. And based on that, as we all know, the Paris Agreement has three main objectives: the temperature goal, for us to enhance resilience and adaptation to climate impacts that is certain to occur. And this is very dear to developing countries. And as such, we would have to align climate action financial flows in Ghana to ensure the implementation of our NDCs. Based on that, we had to develop an NDC implementation, NDC finance strategy. This was actually developed with support from the UNDP. And giving you the background and objective of the report, the climate finance strategy in Ghana is required to address the need for sufficient, predictable, and sustainable financing to tackle climate change issues and to deliver against national and international climate and other related development commitment. Next slide, please. So taking a closer look of our NDC implementation plan, the strategy was based on the implementation plan, and looking at it, it came with 31 program of actions, that is our NDCs, within sector development strategies. It covers both mitigation and adaptation program of actions. And taking a closer look of that, I must say that the funding that is required to implement these actions are, we need about $22.6 billion to be able to implement that. Disaggregating that, we have the unconditional POAs that we need about $6.3 billion, and then for the conditional funding needed is about $16.3 billion. Focusing more on adaptation, we would have to mobilize about $4.21 billion at domestic level for adaptation, and seeking the remaining of about $8.29 billion from international sources to cover the remaining cost of adaptation program of actions. It's indeed worth to say that there is no assessment of capacity and technical capability that was conducted in this particular strategy. The objective of the strategy was to develop a financing strategy for NDC implementation plan. The implementation plan, as I mentioned earlier on, was for 2019. It actually built on NDC implementation plan, the updated actions and plans, including use of our fourth national communication and related efforts to assess priority sector actions in the NDC implementation plan. Next slide, please. As we all know, the NDC is a continuous process, which includes a cycle of analysis, just as we've always done, refinement and update. And so we've updated our NDCs, and it's from 2020 to 2030. And so looking at this cycle, we'd have to analyze the impact after we've implemented the NDC for some time, and then we amend the sector studies that were done. Then we have to refine some of the development plans that we've done, and then we revise our objectives. So it goes in that continuous cycle, which we have done for the second phase of our NDCs. And so a finance strategy must similarly be adjusted and updated in accordance with the NDCs. And the UNFCCC national communication, our fourth national communication, was also taken into consideration. Our updated NDC implementation plan was expected to be done in 2021, but we're still waiting to get access to funds to be able to have those done or completed. Next slide, please. Okay, so looking at the strategy document, we have the strategy methodology where we look at the context and analysis of the current situation. We looked at our country circumstances. We focused on 5 main sectors, and then we also used or aligned it with the NDC implementation plan. Taking a very closer look at the comparative analysis, that is the costing of our NDC program of actions. In undertaking, we should have been able to undertake a comprehensive analysis of cost and specific funding needs of the program of actions, but we're not able to do so. And so looking at what we did, we actually did a comparative assessment. So an analysis of the POAs were based on comparable or equivalent international precedents. That was what was used. And then if you take a look at the document, you can also look at, you can have a look at the outline of the strategy considerations. We also proposed financing framework, and this framework shows how each program of action can be operationalized. And then in the document, you can also look at the outline of the program of action strategies and the proposed set of activities to implement the strategies. Some adjustments are required, and so looking at the 5 main sectors that we focused on, analysis were undertaken only against those that we had or data was available from these sectors, being energy, forestry, transport, water or waste, and then agriculture. And some of the complexities that we came across were that most of the program of actions were ongoing programs, or they had to be implemented within a long-term development plan. It was part of our development plan with a focus on an NDC program. Next slide, please. So giving you a summary of the current situation on climate finance, it's a continuous process, and then I'm looking at how much Africa gets at the end of the period to as part of the climate finance. We realized that there is a financial gap. Taking into consideration our current NDC, Ghana requires about 16 billion to implement its program of actions. And so taking this and then comparing it to what Africa as a whole gets, it means that there's a gap. Also, in implementing our strategy during the COVID time, some of the program of actions were halted due to issues of COVID. And then I must say that the national policy and NDC leadership also ensured that most of the sector policies were aligned and focused or aligned with the NDC development. And then we also used or aligned our NDCs with the SDG and working closely with the SDG leadership, and ensured that our NDCs came or aligned with SDG 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 11, 12, and then 15. And then another area that we also looked at was the opportunity for sustainable green recovery that is driven by increased awareness and the need for resilience of infrastructure and services. Next slide. Okay, on the current situation, there's when it comes to the development of NDCs and ecosystem, there is early progress with NDC development and funding infrastructures. We have sector strategies that need further building and coordination, and then barriers to address, including the energy sector. And then we also have the opportunity to promote and enable local industrial development. On domestic finance, we have government budgets being part of the domestic financing strategies. And then we also have carbon finance. We've actually signed some number of bilateral agreements. And then when it comes to the international ones, we are also looking at vertical funds, multilateral, and then bilateral corporations. On the comparative assessment of the POAs, if you look at our POAs, it presents diverse set of programs, projects, and then funding needs. And then it also has a long-standing activities that is integrated into our development objective. Our unconditional program of actions are clear, and then at the time of development of this program of action, some financial support had been already secured. There's also the need to build distinct financial propositions and then costing within high-level comparison of precedent. And then I mentioned the sectors that we actually focused on, the 5 sectors that we focused on. On the next slide, please. Next slide, please, the strategy considerations. Yes, please. On the diversity of funding needs, it requires investment planning at sector and then POA level. In that, there's a need to have increased coordination across sectors, and program of actions will enable efficiency. Another strategy consideration is to design and develop development of distinct bankable projects. And for us, this is very critical. We would have to look at commercially viable and sustainable investment. And some of the program of actions are ongoing and they have already been embedded into our development activities. Again, another strategy consideration was to build capacity and coordination of implementation. This would have to be, there's a need to acknowledge the need for continued capacity development across government efforts, and then coordination with and across private sector is also needed. Another interesting area that we also look at has to do with issues of cross-cutting. And this is more related to gender, disaster risk reduction, and health risk. These would have to be assessed and incorporated across all investments. And then we also have different approaches that are appropriate for conditional versus unconditional commitments. That is the POAs. The unconditional, we intend to seek funding from government or delivery commitment in place, or has also the potential to leverage on climate bonds or sovereign funding support. When it comes to the conditional, we're looking at a project-focused blended financing approach, and this can be found within the strategy. We've actually come up with all the different sectors, and then the financing framework over there looks at the different blended financing framework that we intend to use. And then we also have the de-risking instruments that is to be used to crowd in new forms of funding. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so on the investment needs, we intend to have a comprehensive, or it's still ongoing actually, a comprehensive stakeholder consultation and engagement for our NDC implementation. We also are in the process, or it's still ongoing. We're conducting a comprehensive analysis of job potentials and economic diversification opportunities for each of our NDC sectors at the economy level. And then we also have started working on NDC investment and implementation action plan. We intend to finalize it as soon as possible. And then we've actually started developing NDC project pipeline, and this is being done by the different 5 sectors I mentioned. Again, we plan to organize NDC investment forum. It's likely to be done this year. On the engagement of Article 6, it already started, it's ongoing, and currently we have about 12 projects on Article 6. And then we also would want to have some policy and regulatory reforms. For example, we intend to have some regulatory reforms on the EPA Act, which is being done and currently seeking approval with the Attorney General's Department. Some emerging experiences and lessons learned is that Article 6 is needed as a driver for our NDC conditional measures and to raise more ambition outside our NDCs. And then we also have coordination and implementation of our NDCs being quite difficult. There is also the need to unlock private sector engagement to be able to drive our NDCs. Another area that is one of the biggest lessons that we've learned is that there's a need to develop awareness materials and tools and funding to conduct investment. And then there's also a lot of lack of awareness, especially at our local level on our NDCs. And then there's also counter-reactive policies within the sectors. I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Juliana. Actually, I think I just wanted to remind everybody, that it's the Q&A does not have to be in the chat function. It's actually there's a separate Q&A a tab at the bottom of the page. You can use that. But thank you so much for those I think lessons learned. I think, Ms. Juliana, your presentation is interesting because it actually looks at the NDC as a whole, and which cuts across adaptation and mitigation. And also it shows that there is quite a lot of more detailed costing that has taken place, and also programs of action that have been defined, even though there needs to be more bankable program development. And I think you also mentioned that it's important to bring that those priorities down to back to the local level, even though they probably have also come from the local level, but then after the NDC has been formulated and this investment plan is being developed, it also needs to go back to the local level. So that's very useful. I think one of the questions in the chat that came up was is it sort of a multi-sectoral I think NDC, or I think the word is in French is global, but I think what they mean is, it is a national, or is there a more sectoral approach being adopted where different sectors are taking their own independent planning and financing? So if you could answer that, I think, before we go to the next presenter. Ms. Bempa? Okay, I'm not sure if we have Miss Bempa on the line. Maybe we would try to request her to answer the question in the chat. In the meantime, I'm very happy to introduce our last presenter for today.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I think I lost some connections. I couldn't hear the question. Maybe
okay.
It can be typed in English and then I'll answer in the chat.
Absolutely. Thank you so much,
yes.
Mr. Bempa. Yeah. So we'll do that. We'll ask a team member to chat it, and thank you for that segment. Okay. So I'm going to now move on to our next presenter, which is Mr. Tim Strawson. He's a SDG Finance Advisor and the team lead on the Integrated National Financing Frameworks, INFFs, within UNDP's Sustainable Finance Hub. And he works very closely with our network of regional and country offices. And for us, it's a very important, equation to bring not only the climate instruments, planning instruments like the NDCs and NAPs, but also the development planning instruments together. And that's actually one of the reasons we have requested him for this presentation, because especially when it comes to adaptation, most of the issues are very intrinsic to development. And the INFF in that sense is a very important framework and needs to be seen in the light of the fact that it can really mainstream adaptation and direct adaptation financing. So with that introduction, I'm going to pass over to you, Tim, for your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rohini. It's a pleasure to join, and thank you, colleagues. I'll give a brief introduction as to what INFFs are, talk a bit about how they're being used by countries around the world, and then some of the potential entry points and connection points that can help to strengthen adaptation financing. So perhaps if we could move to the first slide, I'll go to the next slide, please. What is an integrated national financing framework? To start with the basics, it was introduced in the 2015 Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which was the financing for development agreement that went alongside the Sustainable Development Goals. And that agenda touches on various different aspects of domestic and international public and private financing and the roles that they can play in advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a very comprehensive agenda. And UN member states in that agenda introduced this concept of an integrated national financing framework as a framework that can support at the national level the implementation of the SDGs, bringing together all of those areas of public, private, domestic and international finance into a holistic system. So if we can move to the next slide, I'm going to whiz through a few slides. And where the INFF lands really is that we have, as Rohini was saying, it's a framework for national sustainable development plans. So many countries have a medium-term plan, which is where the SDGs land, or where the SDGs are connected. If we can move to the next slide. And we know that in order to achieve those, we will need both public and private financing, which is, if you could go back just a couple actually. Yeah, stop there maybe. Both public and private sources of financing at the bottom, and that governments have a huge range of policy tools, instruments, regulations, partnerships and collaboration, which they use to mobilize and invest public resources, and which they use to create an environment and to influence and motivate and channel investment from the private sector and other partners. There was a study done in 2019 which looked at national development plans and found that from more than 100 countries, less than 30% were costed. So the investment needs of those national development plans weren't known, and less than only 27% had any kind of financing strategy. And those 27%, most of them were concerned primarily with public finance. So they didn't really consider the role, systematically, the role that the private sector could play, that the financial sector could play in advancing the SDGs, and the policy tools that the government has from its perspective to influence the mobilization and alignment of private capital behind the SDGs. And so it's here where the INFF approach comes in. And if we could move to the next slide, please. It's an approach that helps government often connect its Ministry of Planning with its Ministry of Finance in order to connect the National Development Plan with these financing policy tools. And vertically, it's a framework that helps government to integrate those policy tools individually with all dimensions of the National Sustainable Development Plan, economic, social, and sustainable. And it helps to build horizontally synergies and integration across those policy areas and across the actors, the public and private actors that are active in each area of the financing landscape. So it's a macro level framework that's designed to bring together a financing strategy at the national level to support usually a medium-term national development plan that's embedded into the planning institutions of government. So that's a very brief introduction to the concept of an integrated national financing framework. If we could move to the next slide, please. So I'll say a few words and the next slide on how INFFs are being used, and then where we see some of the potential entry points for climate and adaptation financing, some of which are starting to emerge as INFFs develop, and some of which I think are opportunities to strengthen moving forwards. Next slide, please. So globally, following the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and particularly, I think, in response to the impacts of the pandemic, there's now more than 85 countries that are using this INFF approach, many coming out of the pandemic as they rewrote national development plans or put in place a recovery plan that are using this INFF approach to shape the public and private financing for that plan, cutting across all development contexts. And UNDP is providing technical leadership support to the Ministries of Finance and the Ministries of Planning and the other actors, government and beyond, that are leading these processes at the national level. Next slide, please. Actually, if you could go to the next slide, and then I'll come back to this one. What we're starting to see is these financing strategies that are at the core of INFFs be launched. So many countries started this process in the last couple of years. We've seen 3 countries to date, that's Mongolia, Nigeria, and most recently the Maldives, which I'll say a few words about in a second, launch their financing strategies. And then there's another 28 where they are currently in the process of negotiating, developing their financing strategy, and another 40 countries that plan to do so in the future. And I think there's a great opportunity here, because those financing strategies are national articulations of the financing priorities from the perspective of the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Planning, a range of other public actors and private actors. They're built on wide-ranging multi-stakeholder dialogues at the national level. to inform this financing strategy about priorities for reshaping the national financial architecture to be more sustainable, to support the National Development Plan. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to connect with the NDCs, with adaptation priorities. We're starting to see that come through in a number of countries, but I think there's opportunity for that to grow moving forwards. Maybe we could go back to the next slide. Perfect. And as we see these financing strategies develop, what they are articulating, as I said, is reforms to reshape the financial architecture at the national level to make it more sustainable, more inclusive, to help it really drive progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the aspirations of the National Sustainable Development Plans. And as they are taking shape, we're seeing countries prioritize a very large and very diverse range of specific reforms that are designed to catalyze this transformation. I won't go through this chart in detail, but it captures, we did a survey last year, we asked around 50 countries responded, and they told us that the financing reforms that were being prioritized in those financing strategies, and they cut across a very wide range of areas of public and private finance. And we're already starting to see many of these be implemented and bear fruit. So for example, in Gabon, green tax reforms and reforms to make the tax incentives that are provided in key economic sectors much more sustainable, responsive to the climate environmental priorities of the national plan as it moves from a brown to green economy. In Indonesia, for example, we've seen a wide range of thematic bond issuances that have to date mobilized close to $8 billion. Most recently, last week, they had their inaugural blue bond issuance, but mobilizing capital for investment in a range of SDG-linked and climate-linked financing areas of investment. And Mongolia, for example, has taken forward a range of reforms through its INFF, including the establishment of a green finance corporation as something that can act, an institution that can act in the financial sector to drive capital towards green investments. So what we're seeing as these financing strategies emerge is an agenda of reforms across public and private financing that is being connected with sustainable and social objectives and has the potential to be connected to drive forwards adaptation, financing for adaptation. If we could move to the next slide, please. I'll end with one quick example before I touch on what I see as the wider opportunities. But the Maldives is the most recent country to have launched its financing strategy. In the Maldives, they took the approach that all finance should be climate finance, and they've launched a gender responsive climate financing strategy. But the Ministry of Finance launched it a couple of months ago. It has 3 overarching objectives. I won't go through this slide in detail, but really it's to drive the transformation from a fossil fuel-based economy towards investment in a more resilient, sustainable development path where all finance is climate finance, as I said. And they've set out a very clear agenda of 16 policy objectives, which are designed to catalyze this transition to a more sustainable financing architecture at the national level. And then next slide, please. Within those 16 policy areas, we see a number that are already connected with adaptation and a number where there are opportunities as they're implemented to connect and strengthen financing for adaptation. So I won't go through these all in detail, but it covers areas such as climate risk insurance and how you can build greater and wider insurance coverage to increase resilience to natural disasters, climate and adaptation stress testing within the financial sector, how you can systematically map investment opportunity areas that are catalytic for SDG progress and progress towards the adaptation objectives, but while also being attractive to the private sector. And then how do you build incentives from the perspective of government to mobilize and channel and promote investment in those areas? The government is looking at developing a sustainable finance taxonomy that will help it understand and track where investments are being made relative to its sustainable and climate objectives. And that can be a basis also for incentives that promote and channel investment in the most impactful areas. The building of disclosure and capacity for disclosure practices across the private sector, as well as changes in the budget system that will help to tag, monitor and manage investment in the country's sustainable development objectives in line with its strategic action plan, as well as its NDC. And so we're already seeing in the Maldives, this is an example, I think, where a number of the reforms are linked to adaptation, and there's opportunities those are taken forwards to really drive and strengthen financing towards adaptation. So I'll close with just a few words on the more general opportunity. I think if we could go to the next slide, as we look across the countries that we're supporting to develop integrated national financing frameworks, we see that these financing strategies that are being developed at the moment and will be launched in the coming year and couple of years present a really good opportunity to mainstream adaptation and climate objectives within the core of the development planning system and with the core of the connection between planning and financing. So questions we're asking are, can there be an integrated financing strategy rather than having a financing strategy for the SDGs or for the National Development Plan over here, and then a financing strategy for the NDC over here? How can those be brought together? And how can the INFF provide a platform that from an NDC, from an adaptation perspective, brings those priorities to the center of finance policy making, and from the Ministry of Finance's perspective, helps strengthen financing and investment in a more resilient, climate-proof, sustainable development path. So how can the financing reforms that are being prioritized and taken forwards and driven through this INFF process, how can they be designed so that they're mindful of and connected with the country's adaptation priorities? And how can the platforms that INFFs are providing for these quite wide-ranging discussions on financing priorities and challenges that bring together policymakers from across government, from the private and financial sectors, from civil society and development partners and beyond, how can those platforms be used to really consider adaptation priorities, to consider financing for a more resilient development path? So I think as these INFFs take hold, as they grow to maturity, and as these financing strategies are finalized and taken forward to implementation, I think there's a big opportunity to connect with adaptation priorities in order to mainstream investment in those priorities through these national financing strategies. So I will close there with just one final word, which is on the next slide. If you want to find out more about INFFs, we've got a range of resources, guidance notes, there's an e-learning course. We've got quite a lot of information on our INFF.org website about where different countries are in the process and some of the resources that are and outputs that are coming through from those national processes. So I will stop there and pass back to you, Rahini. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I'd like to ask Melanie to maybe maybe go to the second last slide of your presentation, where you showed the opportunities for adaptation financing. I mean, thank you so much. I mean the second last, exactly this one. I think, Tim, this was I'm very happy we had your presentation towards the end, because in many ways we have gone through the progression of the climate planning instruments, but in many ways the INFF is sort of the mainstream kind of planning instrument that the finance and planning ministries would use in developing countries. And I think that you are actually providing quite a, I think there was a lot in your presentation. There's a lot of details, and we don't have enough time to go into today, but these overall opportunities are showing that there's a cross section of work that can happen, so that there's no parallel climate planning taking place, but that there is one sort of an integrated effort, so that countries are doing their development budget planning and budgeting, not in parallel with the climate related activities. So that's extremely useful. Actually, we do, we are sort of coming to towards the end of this session. I feel like quite a few questions have been raised in the live chat, which are, some of them are very broad. So, we're going to, for example, one participant has actually asked an open question, and I don't think we can actually address it to any panelists, because it's a very big question. It's about the fact that there are these world agendas, the Addis Ababa agenda, SDGs, Paris, and quite a few countries are off track, and what can the UN do to really bring them on track? And I want to thank this participant for this question, but I think this is a very, very big question, and I think that this is a subject of it's going to be different for every country, and we don't have a specific presentation on this topic, but I think in many ways the different presentations speak to this topic. So I'm not going to address this really to anyone at the moment. This is, I think, a very major question that requires much bigger sort of a discussion, and it will be different for each country. I think there is also one question which is to do with, specifically whether, I think the question is from Panama, whether they can get the support to develop their health information system. I think that maybe the question is for the NDC partnership colleague, but I would suggest that we maybe get into further touch after the webinar, so that we can put the colleague from Panama in touch with the NDC partnership to see if they can benefit from this support. So actually we do have one hand raised. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it is, I think it's Mr. Tamba. I want to ask you, Mr. Tamba, your hand was raised. Would you like to come in with the last question before I wrap up the session? Okay. I'm actually not sure if, okay, I'm not sure if he's going to ask the question, but obviously I'd like to just let everybody know that they can, please feel free to reach out to us to any time, because this is not a one-off engagement. I mean, we do want to continue these discussions through a series of webinars. So I actually want to, at this stage, wrap up. A lot of questions came in the Q&A. So, I think that we have been able to cover some ground here. But let me just say a few things about, sort of our next steps in terms of, where we go from here on these webinars. So basically, I think what you all would like to, firstly, a very big thank you to all of you that have attended. We had a lot of very rich presentations, but that is by design, because there's a lot of discussion globally about adaptation finance gaps, but we want to move the discussion more towards solutions and how countries are actually proceeding despite those gaps. So big thank you to everyone who stayed with us, and especially to the presenters. Each of them has brought a new instrument, that is trying to bring adaptation finance, sort of further. So with the NAPs, we heard there's a financing strategy developed with the NDC investment planning tool, and also the example of Ghana. We saw that there are, sort of like a cross-cutting investment plan that has been developed. And with the INFF example, we got the sense that there is a much bigger world of the development planning instruments that can be used. And with the Bosnia presentation, we got a very specific example of a local level, how detailed and how how the issue of adaptation finance is being developed, as per the local sort of the local priorities and the local balance sheets. So we're going to wrap up. I want to also thank the interpreters very much, because some of the sound was interrupted, but we have recorded the webinar so that for people who would like to attend that later. And also a very big thank you to NDC partnership colleagues who contributed, because they are co-partners of the accelerator, and also to our team. This is the first webinar we do, so please bear with us because there were a few glitches with the different languages. When we close this webinar, you will get a short survey. Please do share your feedback, because we would like to use those learnings for the next webinars. And we don't have exact dates for the next webinars, but we'll be looking at different financing instruments, domestic, so private financing and public financing. But also we'll be looking across the thematic nexus areas like biodiversity, nature, and adaptation finance. How can we bring this together? Also on subnational and urban resilience, we touched on that today, but we'll do a bit more of that in future, and many other topics. So with that, I think I'm going to now close the webinar with a thank you to all the team that has been behind the scenes. And we look forward to seeing you another time. And please do fill up the survey before you leave. see you again in hopefully in the near future. Thank you.